And so now it is my honor to welcome you here today for an important conversation as we mark a very grim milestone this week, the 1 year anniversary of the fall of Kabul. I know that for so many in our community, this is a painful moment, but it is also a moment that demands that we look closely at where we are and where we must go as advocates and humanitarians working together with the people of Afghanistan for a better future. We all know that every day is a challenge for those struggling to survive against all odds in Afghanistan, and also for those Afghans here in the United States who we welcomed as our neighbors. The road ahead to lasting security and safety is long and perilous. We are very fortunate today to be joined by my colleague at Refugees International, the Vice President for Programs and Policy, Hardin, who traveled to Afghanistan in June to speak directly with the people involved in the humanitarian response inside of Afghanistan. His report on the current situation and recommendations for a sustainable way ahead was released today, and you can find the link in the chat. As we look ahead today towards the prospects for Afghanistan's future, we are very honored to be joined by 4 people who know this best. Saad Mohseni, who's the CEO of the Moby Group and the owner of Tolo TV. Mary-Ellen McGroarty, who is a country director for UN World Food Program in Afghanistan. Roshan Mashal, deputy director of the Afghans Women's Network and a visiting scholar and fellow at the University of Texas at Arlington. And Joseph Azam, board chair of the Afghan-American Foundation. Our guests this morning will share their reflections on pathways out of the current crisis. They'll also talk about key proposals for staving off the worst as we prepare for Afghan's second harsh winter under Taliban rule. They'll also talk about the experiences of women inside of Afghanistan and the critical role that women play in the humanitarian response. And finally, we will focus on the urgent importance of passing the Afghan Adjustment Act and many more topics. We will have time at the end for the audience to answer questions and answers. So please include your questions in the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your screen, and a member of our team will send the question to our moderator. Now, Hardin, over to you and to the speakers. Thank you all for being with us today.
Maureen, thank you very much. And welcome to the audience. And thanks so much to the panelists who are joining us from time zones stretching from the Pacific coast of the United States to London to Kabul. We're really honored to have you here. I'm going to say a couple of remarks about my trip in June and some of the initial findings from that. I mean, as most folks know, obviously this week marks the 1 year anniversary of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. And for most Afghans, it's been a year of hunger. As most of you know, donors responded to the Taliban's violent seizure of power a year ago and their subsequent repression by freezing development aid and cutting off Afghanistan from the global financial system. These measures, together with some other factors, helped trigger the collapse of the country's anemic economy. As famine loomed, international aid agencies and their Afghan partners launched the largest relief operation in the history of the country. And I was honored to get to see some of that in action. The operation kept catastrophe at bay, but when I was there in June, it was clear the crisis was far from over. The overall humanitarian situation remains one of the worst in the world, and the economy shows no sign of recovery. This year's harvest will likely underdeliver, and donors are falling short. And just to complicate matters, the war in Ukraine is making it harder to get aid into the country. As Marshall will probably talk about, the Taliban's oppression of women and girls is also taking a significant humanitarian toll. Afghan female aid workers are finding it hard to do their jobs, and women and girls in need are becoming harder to reach. But there are opportunities to better serve women and girls who are in need of humanitarian assistance, and donors need to be a bit more pragmatic and flexible to exploit wherever these openings can be found. Another challenge lies at the thorny intersection of the Taliban and aid delivery. Donors are understandably concerned that the de facto authorities are benefiting from humanitarian assistance. And indeed, the UN has documented Taliban interference in relief operations. But aid workers in Afghanistan will compare the situation of aid diversion inside the country to other well-known trouble spots like Syria and Yemen. And for them, it's not as dire. And aid agencies have also developed systems for managing Taliban interference. These systems depend on regular engagement with the Taliban, let's be honest about that, across the country in a very deep way. And that is something that is harder for some donors and some Western publics to understand, but it's an essential ingredient of success. I think Saad may have some things to say about that, but at a more global level as we move forward. In addition, the aid architecture in Afghanistan is not quite yet fit for purpose. Challenges are emerging as the UN tries to deliver basic services and build resilience and early recovery. And the sheer magnitude of the international relief effort is also raising some concerns over the emergence of parallel structures and systems and a loss of Afghan ownership. The sanctions regime and the lack of a central bank continue to take a major toll on aid operations and indeed on the economy writ large. And all of this underscores the need for a clear and more detailed plan for where the aid effort is headed. One thing was clear from my visit: the people of Afghanistan are continuing to pay the price for the yawning gap between Western demands and policy objectives and Taliban repression. Western countries have rightly called for the Taliban to form an inclusive government, respect human rights, particularly those of women and girls, and to ensure that the country does not once again become a center for international terrorism. But the movement has done very little to comply, and it's far from clear that donors have the tools to change Taliban behavior. So none of this is to suggest that the international community should reward the Taliban with vast sums of cash and legitimacy, but donors could be more precise and more realistic about what they're trying to achieve in Afghanistan. And Afghans need a greater say in the process that safeguards their institutions and capacity where that capacity exists. And all this is going to require greater donor engagement in Afghanistan, particularly as the country braces for what promises to be another very difficult winter. So with that, I thought I would turn to Saad, help us unpack all of this. And in particular, Saad, you had a piece in Foreign Affairs this last week, which was quite powerful, sort of reviewing the decades of failed Western policies in Afghanistan and the evolution of Taliban politics and policy and the implications for sort of a US and donor strategy on engagement. Can you talk a little bit about what lessons we can draw from your piece on the road ahead out of the current humanitarian crisis? Saad, over to you.
Thank you. I think first and foremost, it's not easy. There are no simple solutions. I think at the outset, I have to point that out that even my piece, I mean, the frustration is that we must engage, we should engage, even just to deliver the humanitarian assistance, but we're on a trajectory that it doesn't look good. Their stance on a lot of issues have hardened, stances have hardened, and it seems very hopeless. But as an Afghan, and given that 38 million people are still stuck inside the country, where their situation is quite desperate, not just on the humanitarian side, but you mentioned the case of our women, half the population. It's almost unthinkable to imagine what difficulties people face. We're being told on a daily basis about middle-class Afghans, men and women, begging on the streets of Kabul, people who were working in government offices only 12 months ago. And just for you to imagine how much the country had changed in 20 years, we are the youngest country outside of sub-Saharan Africa, median age of 18, 65, perhaps more Afghans under the age of 25, vastly urbanized. And literacy rates are much higher than they were in 2001. But what's extraordinary is that the younger people, literacy rates are in the 70-odd% if you look at the under 25s. Although the overall literacy rate's around 40%, still double what it was in 2001. So you're looking at a vastly educated, urbanized, sophisticated, aspirational population relative to the last time the Taliban were in town. So it's much more difficult because most of these young people had never experienced anything like the Taliban. So for them, this experience of the last 12 months is very jarring, which we can talk about because even for the Taliban, it's difficult for them to govern in the way that they had in the past. So you have this confluence of disasters, the crises that we're seeing in terms of internally displaced people, COVID-related economic hardships, climate change, and of course this economic collapse that we've seen, that the bulk of the money that ended up in Afghanistan annually just disappeared. And on top of that, we lost perhaps our best in 2 weeks. The brain, it was a brain drain on steroids in the last 2 weeks of August. So it's plunged the country into, perhaps one of the most impoverished nations on the planet. And on top of that, because of the crisis in the Ukraine, food prices have gone up by almost 30% across the board if you look at the UN figures. And something like 95% of the country is going to be plunged into poverty by the end of this year. People don't have enough to, and our friend from the WFP can probably comment on this, people just simply don't have enough to eat. And we don't have enough hard currency because money's been printed sitting in Poland and France. I mean, anything you can imagine going wrong has gone wrong in the place. We've had earthquakes, we've had floods, all sorts of natural disasters. And as you pointed out, it's not a question of just delivering humanitarian aid, because in 3 or 4 months we'll be back where we were 12 months ago. So what's the world prepared to do in terms of development or basic needs, as the UN calls it, in terms of food security, in terms of livelihoods? And what I've argued in my piece is that we have to engage. I mean, I think that, is there a path to moderate the Taliban? It seems unlikely, but are there individuals who have a different vision to the leadership in terms of engaging with the world, in terms of girls' education? And the answer to that is yes. And unless we properly engage, all of us, Afghans as well as our foreign friends and allies and the UN and so forth, we will never find out. That's very important. The other important thing, I think, is that the world needs to somehow help get some of our assets in terms of being, allowing the Afghan central bank to utilize these assets. We need to be able to print money. I mean, of the hard currency that's technically should be in circulation, only 10 or 20% is in circulation. Most of the other currency is worn out. It's not usable. So people don't even have hard currency to transact it, for example. So we have to work on solutions in terms of allowing the central bank, even if it's notionally under the control of the Taliban, to function, to be able to get the economy going. And something people don't talk about is a banking crisis in the next month or two. It is very possible for many of the banks to go belly up, and that's going to further deteriorate the situation on the ground. I'll leave it at that, but the situation is very dire. I'm not particularly hopeful, but what I've argued in my piece and what I continue to argue is that the world cannot turn its back on 38 million Afghans because of a government that's not particularly appealing.
So thank you very much. I mean, I think those points are all extremely well taken. And particularly on the humanitarian piece, Mary-Ellen, let me turn to you now. I was sort of fortunate enough to see up close how WFP really has performed and sort of shouldered much of the responsibility, along with much of the responsibility, along with other UN agencies, to sort of staving off Afghanistan's hunger crisis. Heading into last winter, the predictions were pretty dire. We had 1 million children could starve to death. In the event, it appears that the humanitarian firewall held, but now Afghans face a second winter under the Taliban, and the underlying humanitarian indicators are again quite grim. What lessons from the last year for the aid effort going forward, and what are your main concerns as we head into the second year of a crisis?
Thank you, Hardin, and delighted to join you from Kabul this evening. It's evening and good morning to everyone on that side. Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, with the 15th of August, just a couple of days past, there's been a lot of reflection by those of us that were here on the 15th of August last year, before it, and have been here throughout the last 12 months in how the year has gone and what we're facing into, and what the people of Afghanistan are facing into another bleak winter. What is certain is, you know, for those of us that are around a long time, and I mean, I'm with the World Food Programme a long time, I've never seen a crisis escalate and implode at the scale and the depth that I saw, that we witnessed in Afghanistan, and continues, sadly. You know, I mean, it's a country, you know, just to sadly say, it's a country of widespread poverty and hunger. And it's desperately sad, you know, and the loss of hope and potential. And I witness that every single day that I talk to women. And I mean, a woman myself, you know, I mean, and every day that I talk to young women here in the office, that extinguishing of hope and potential, that suddenly, that the 15th of August, I mean, it was far from perfect before the 15th of August, but that transition on the 15th of August just flipped the switch that changed everything in terms of that. Yeah, last year, you know, we watched, you know, I mean, already before the 15th of August, you know, we had the worst drought in 3 decades. We had the impact of COVID. We had the raging conflict in the last, you know, 8-9 months of the battle for Afghanistan that really that displaced over 700,000 people across the rural areas, that destroyed a lot of the infrastructure. So we already started dealing with that. But then just what happened after the 15th of August in terms of watching the loss of employment, you know, on those planes, the middle class left, so the rupturing of the middle class and the economic ecosystem that was beneath that, the economic ecosystem that was beneath the large international footprint, you know, and we're seeing probably a more cataclysmic effect now in, you know, in 2021 compared to what we saw in 2014, because if anyone goes back and analyzes, you know, that reconfiguration in 2014 that did impact on GDP. So that just, you know, you just take the rug even more from under, and that imploded. And then just, I mean, for those of us who were relatively new to Afghanistan, I mean, I had only come in October 2020. I think I was staggered, and a few of us were staggered by the absence of the resilience in the system, how it so quickly, you know, just crumbled. You know, within weeks, you know, I had been out with the representative of UNICEF in places like Iraq and everything else, and we were already starting to see malnutrition pictures that were looking like pictures we were seeing out of Yemen, and we're like, oh my goodness, what is, you know, what is going on? And everywhere I went, you know, I was hearing about how the economic crisis was just piling the woes on top of people. I met farmers up in Badishkan. You know, that's, I suppose, the bittersweet thing about it at the moment is we can get out more across the country than you used to. They told me, I mean, they had lived through decades of conflict, but they had never faced such hardship as they were currently facing at the moment. But thankfully to the donors, I mean, really the international community, they stood up, they stood with us, and we were able to mount the largest humanitarian response. I mean, up to June 2022, we've been able to reach over 20 across Afghanistan, unprecedented scale of a humanitarian operation. You know, in terms of lessons learned, you know, what we did in WFP and from where I sat was we deployed every tool we had to do a no regrets approach. I mean, borrowed money internally, everything else to get supplies into the line and into the supply line. And I think it was that ability to be able to get out fast and high that really pulled people back from the brink. But it's not over, and this is the concern, you know, with that massive effort, that's, you know, that just pulled people back from the brink. But the dial hasn't changed on anything for the people of Afghanistan. The economic crisis, as Saad said, continues, and the longer it goes on, the deeper it gets. You know, jobs haven't come back, the liquidity crisis continues, the financial crisis continues. We have to moderate our expectations for the harvest because there has been back-to-back droughts in some places. Temperatures were too high in March, so the snow melt has been rapid. We had the earthquake, massive destruction of that. And at the moment we're running because there's floods across 10 provinces, harvests are being destroyed, households are being destroyed, orchards. So it's just one thing on top of the other for the people of Afghanistan. And, you know, going forward, my real concerns are that the crisis gets beyond us. You know, we need those investments, we need solutions to start coming off, you know, to bring down the humanitarian needs. You know what I mean? And this is what, you know, so, but we need the humanitarian response, because I need to eat today while I wait for the wheat to grow and be ready tomorrow. You know, so the humanitarian response must continue at scale, but alongside that, we need investments, we need solutions for the people of Afghanistan that help them to build a functioning economy, some self-reliance from the grassroots up, from the community up. So that is really my plea. You know, I mean, it's another bleak winter coming up. The levels of debt across Afghanistan are crippling. The coping mechanisms are done. You know, the household assets are sold, they have nothing. So we need to do that double track approach. The other thing that worries me, and you know, touched a bit on by Saad, is the Taliban and our continued and the engagement, what that's going to look like, you know, at the national level, who is in charge? You know, I mean, there's different numerous committees and everything else starting to emerge. You know, we're seeing a little more assertiveness around interference. We're still able to hold that wall with that, but will we be able to continue with that? You know, the difference between the local and the national, you know, the more and more decrees. So that's really, and what our engagement as the international community is going to look like. You know what I mean? And I think the weeks, and I mean, nobody needs to revisit the events over the last couple of weeks, what that means in terms of our engagement as well. And then of course the resourcing, you know what I mean? Because we do need a continued we need a large humanitarian response, but we need more than that. We need to somehow protect some of those gains that were made over the 20 years. We cannot, I mean, if there's to be political agency, if there is to be agency in the people of Afghanistan, we need to get beyond humanitarian. But with the political crisis we have, the human rights crisis, the different priorities, for me, the resourcing, you know, so my urge is really for the international community to really stand with Afghanistan. Over.
Thank you, Mary-Ellen. And one of the things when I was out there that was really of concern in what you're saying, and we can get into this in the next round of discussions, was the pre-positioning effort, right? That was a thing where you really needed resources up front to begin the pre-positioning of food aid around the country. You know, with winter, you know, months away still, it had to start early. And there we were seeing a lack of the kind of resources that were required. And so, you know, it would be interesting to hear a bit more about that. The other thing I'd just like to say, reflect upon, you know, you talk about where you were able to, you know, where you've been able to go, what you were seeing, and the level of scale up that the humanitarian system went through. One of the things that was quite just incredibly impressive to me is to see, you know, it's the Afghans who are driving this. They're the ones who are on the front line, the Afghan staff, and the kind of risks and the conditions under which they were working. You know, they tell the story of a year ago as their cities fell, staying in post, right, and continuing to do incredibly challenging work without any idea of what, you know, tomorrow held. So, you know, to me, making sure that they're in a position to continue to deliver has to be something that we focus on in an incredibly intense way. Marcel, would you mind if I turn to you and just say a little bit about, you know, last spring, we were just incredibly honored to you know, honor you for your extraordinary work on behalf of women who remain in Afghanistan. You did all of this even as you negotiated a new life here in the United States as a recent, you know, evacuee from Afghanistan. What are you hearing from the women inside of Afghanistan who you continue to work with, and on behalf you continue to work, about the impact of the current humanitarian crisis? And what are your messages to donors and Western policymakers on what can be done to make tangible improvements in their lives? Marshall, over to you.
بسیار زیاد تشکر. سلام به همه دوستا. من بسیار زیاد تشکر میکنم از تمام دوستای بین‌المللی که اینجا حضور دارن و برای مسئله افغانستان رسیدگی میکنن، مخصوصا خانم مری که در افغانستان هستن و مشکلات از نزدیک میبینن و از اونا رسیدگی میکنن. ما باید باز هم اکیداً بگویم که بحران سیاسی که در افغانستان رخ داد در 21 اگست سال 2021 و منجر به تشدید و افزایش بحران اقتصادی، بحران اجتماعی در افغانستان شد، ما نهایت متاثر هستیم و متاثر به این هستیم که این بحران هر روز بیشتر از روز گذشته بدتر شده میره. در جریان یک سال ما شاهد مسائل بسیار خطرناک در افغانستان هستیم که از اون جمله گرسنگی است، فقر است، بیکاری است، مهاجرت های اجباری است، تبعید فعالان و ژورنالیستان و همچنان کارمندان سابق دولت و همچنان فعالین فرهنگی به شدت هستیم. همچنان سرکوب آزادی بیان، سرکوب زنان و دختران که به خاطر آزادی و به خاطر نان و به خاطر کار صدای خود بلند کردن، همه روزه
whoever raises his voice, they are killed or they're being put in prison. And the women of Afghanistan always speaks up and raises their voices.
گزارشات مختلف از نهادهای مختلف مثل سازمان غذایی، سازمان جهانی غذا، مثلا سازمان بین المللی صلیب سرخ و همچنان
We have a lot of donors like Red Crescent, like United Nations, like World Bank and other international donors. They help us a lot. We have around 33 million child in hunger crisis. Around 22 million people, they have lack of foods on table. And we need urgent humanitarian aid.
یک رقم بسیار بالا را بیشتر از 55% جمعیت نشان میده. تماس که
more than 55% of the Afghan people are in crisis.
دریافت میکنیم به خاطر از اینکه ما میبینیم که اکثریت نهادهای کمک کننده و همچنان میدیا و نهادهای خبرگزاری در نقاط دوردست افغانستان به هیچ گونه دسترسی نداره. به طور مثال
we see that these humanitarian aid that goes to Afghanistan, it has only their aids in the central of the cities. They don't have around all Afghanistan. Like Red Crescent organization, they only distribute like food and shelters and clothing items only in 11 cities and 11 provinces of Afghanistan. And those who live far away from the cities, so nobody help in those locations. And even in capital Kabul, most of the people, they eat instead of 3 times a day, they eat only 1 time. What the Taliban put new rule and regulation for the women and especially the girls' education. This is the worst in the history. Women cannot work. Women cannot work in an organization or international NGOs. And even since 1 year, all these girls going to school, the schools are closed. Since 1 year, all the schools are closed beyond the 6th grade education, and it's very difficult.
به مکتب نمیته، پس امو سیستم یا هم زنجیره سیستم رسیدگی اشتراک دخترها به تحصیلات عالی و همچنان به بازار.
The Taliban don't allow the girls in order to get more education beyond the 6th grade. So basically they don't want to see a bright woman in Afghanistan. In politics, there is no women. In justice offices, there is no women. So everywhere, women are not working anymore. They are all at home.
و دخترای افغانستان روبرو به او هستند. یک مسئله، یک بحران جدی است که اگر
Afghan peoples are facing this crisis, especially the women and girls of Afghanistan, which is not acceptable.
اکثریت مردم در یک روز همه چیز خود از دست دادیم.
و از 1 year, you know how we fled Afghanistan in very short days, and we came to US. And a lot of Afghans left Afghanistan in days, and they leave everything behind.
نظر به بحران اقتصادی و اجتماعی و سیاسی که در افغانستان هست، هر کس کوشش میکنه که از افغانستان برآید که یک
because of the political crisis and hunger crisis and instability, especially the younger generation are leaving the country.
ما در یک سال گذشته تنها کسایی که صدای خود بلند کردن زنای افغانستان بودند.
In last 1 year, only girls and women of Afghanistan raised their voices in order to get more education and work in public. We don't have proper medical services. We don't have at all the inhuman situation we are facing. And we as a woman of Afghanistan, we stand in front of those who does not give us our rights. We have a lot of reports. We get reports.
و به او اکتفا کردن، ولی اقدام عملی که بتونه مردم افغانستان از این وضعیت سخت نجات بده و از این وضعیت بحرانی نجات بده.
But the current regime, Taliban, does not make any proper system in order to run the economic system of Afghanistan. Even we have received some of the humanitarian aid from different donors, from international donors, but we have reports that some Talibans, they didn't distribute it properly in pupils, those who affect with the floods and earthquakes. And most of those who are in need, they didn't receive this humanitarian aid.
مسئله عدم امنیت اقلیت‌های دینی و مذهبی و همچنان کشتارهایی که دوام داره، تمامش بحران است که بحران به شدت بحران در افغانستان.
We have different crises like religion and economic issues. And after the fighting starts in Ukraine, so we were ignored by the international donors mostly. People are facing with hungers and political instability.
هنوز هم مردم کوشش میکنن که مهاجرت ها را ترجیح میدن نسبت به بودن در کشور.
People prefers in order to migrate to different countries, especially to European countries, in order to get a peace life, in order to leave the economic crisis in Afghanistan. We will face more and more crisis in employment, and maybe around 3 million people, especially the child, will die in the next few years. We have a lot of people leaving the country because of the unemployment in Afghanistan today. Some of the youngsters, because they don't have employment, they may join different groups, including terrorist groups, in order to get some money. And we have the news that some of the families, they sell their child in order to get money and eat some food on table. And even we faces that some of the families, they sell their daughters for marriages. We have different horrible cases and news we have.
که تهدید میکنه ای است که اگر امی محدودیت ها در افغانستان ادامه پیدا کنه، این بحران ادامه پیدا کنه.
Most important thing, if the crisis will continue, So it will be a very big danger for us, for a stable Afghanistan, the map of the world. If if our country continues like this in crisis and the world does not make a map for Afghanistan in order how to run the crisis, economic crisis and political crisis, I think we have different issues like political issues, we have regional issues, and we may have export of more fumes and drugs.
سر از این بحران ها به وجود میاد، باید غافل نباشیم و اون سطحی نگیریم و الهی که باید فاجعه.
We should not ignore the dangers that will occur regionally and internationally in the world.
Thank you so much.
I think my time is complete, so in the next session we'll talk more.
Marshall, thank you so much. We really appreciate the comments, and I hope everyone was able to click over to English interpretation for those who needed it in English, but that was really powerful. Joseph, do you mind if I turn to you now? Just to note that under your leadership, the Afghan-American Foundation has done extraordinary work over the last year to support tens of thousands of Afghans who were evacuated to the United States, and for many Afghans who were left behind by the airlift. Now there is some new hope for Afghan evacuees with the introduction of the Afghan Adjustment Act. Can you talk a bit about where we are with the act and what needs to happen to get it over the finish line, and what U.S. policymakers should be doing for Afghans who were left behind?
Sure, Hardin, and thank you for being here, for having us here, and it's really a privilege to be on a panel with my colleagues here. And it's very striking to hear what's happening in Dari. It has a very different impact, I have to say. And one of the things I wanted to make sure we don't miss that Roshan Jones said was that the only people who are consistently raising their voices in opposition to the Taliban are Afghan women. And I think that warrants lingering for a minute when people are staring down guns with signs. So as you mentioned, our foundation's been focused on helping here in Afghanistan, but we're an Afghan-American foundation and recognize that there's a need to focus on the population here to some degree. And while we're not generally, in the business of pushing for legislation, this particular legislation is something that we really wanted to advocate for. Just to set the table, Hardin, there are approximately 76,000 Afghans who came to the US or were brought to the US by the US government in the last year. They were all brought into the US under a status called Humanitarian Parole, which is a temporary status that's for a year or two, and it usually is offered in small measures for populations where their home countries are not secure. And so those folks were brought in, and they have in that past year gone from military bases to communities across America, stretching from Maine to the very southern part of Arizona to the border areas in Texas. And the problem that existed for all of them and for us as a community is that they didn't have permanent status, and they don't have permanent status. And so at some point within this period of time, they would have to apply for asylum. The asylum system in the United States is broken. The current backlog is over 600,000 cases. The immigration backlog writ large is over almost 1.5 million cases. And so you have 76,000 Afghans who've gone through tremendous trauma, who've been brought to the United States with a promise of safety, being put into this juggernaut of a system that's not working for anybody. And so what we recognized, and I think many members in Congress recognized, was that there needs to be a solution, and that there was a precedent for this type of solution. After the Vietnam War, there was an Adjustment Act that was passed in the United States to address the population of over 130,000 Vietnamese who were brought over in very similar circumstances. And so the impetus for this act was to mirror that, to be consistent with what we've done for other populations. What does the act do? The most important thing that the act does, Hardin, is it provides a path to permanent safety and permanent security, which is what Maureen talked about, really, right, for the Afghans who have been brought over here. It does that in a couple of critical ways. The first thing it does is that it takes off the table for most of these Afghans that need to apply for asylum to adjust to permanent status, right? It creates a mechanism for them to become legal permanent residents in the United States without doing that. Now, a lot of the concern and the questions were about vetting. The act as proposed actually has the gold standard of vetting, which is the vetting that exists in place for the US refugee program. So these folks are going to get permanent status, they're going to be vetted, and most importantly, they're going to have the ability to have the peace of mind to rebuild their lives here. And they've already been doing that, right? People have enrolled their children in school. People have gotten jobs. People are contributing to the economy. We have people who are now helping other evacuees, right? There are Afghans who have been evacuated who work with IRC, with Catholic Charities. They're working with organizations that help bring them in and set them up. And now they're helping other Afghans who are here. I think one of the things that we talk about when we talk about this legislation is the fact that it actually also addresses the moral injury that has been inflicted on Afghans by the United States. And when I talk about that, it's very pointed and specific, because one of the things that we hear from the population here, and listening to Mary-Ellen and Roshan and Saad, you recognize that there have been a string of broken promises that the US has made to Afghans over decades, but certainly over the last couple of years. And so one of the most important things this legislation does, in addition to addressing a very dire need for status and safety, is it's a down payment on helping Afghans otherwise, right? It's an acknowledgement of the service that a lot of these Afghans provided to the United States, frankly, for decades. It's an acknowledgement of the promises that were made on the battlefield and in offices across Afghanistan and on planes on the way here, that, that they would not be forgotten. And so if it passes, and it should, right? I should mention that it's bipartisan, which is critical. If it passes, it offers a small measure of justice for those that were brought over. Now, what does the calendar look like and what needs to happen? People who are more expert than me can tell you about that, but I would say that our view is that we have about 45 to 50 days. By the end of September, that's when we want to make a push to get this done. We're all aware of the political climate in the US. We're approaching an election, and there's an opportunity in that window of time for us to get Congress focused bicamerally on this and get this passed. And I think the messages that have been resonating with members are that this is not an immigration issue, and it isn't. This is actually a national security issue in a lot of ways. You have Afghans who were part of our mission, the US's mission in Afghanistan. They're at risk. You have the veterans community who's highlighted this as the biggest priority going forward for the US government in righting these wrongs. And you have a population, frankly, that would be in extreme danger if it were ever the case that they would be sent back, right? And if not for their service for years and their connections to the US for years, then for the very fact that they were able to get out of Afghanistan in the first place. And so that's what our focus is, Hardin. I'm happy to talk about it more, but to us, this is probably the most important moment for the Afghan diaspora in the US in our history. And I should mention that we have 500,000 people here anyway, right? So we're a strong diaspora, but I think it's also an important moment for America. And so as we talk about what's happening in Afghanistan, all of these things are connected, right? And we have to be able to do multiple things at once. We have to be able to help multiple segments of Afghans at the same time. And in this small window that exists in the next couple of weeks, our advocacy and our push is to get Congress focused on helping the Afghans that we brought over in the last year, and creating a situation where people are welcomed and they understand that this is home. And that's the message that the Afghan-American Foundation is putting out there. Our partners in the veteran community are putting out there that this is home. And we're hoping that by doing that, it also keeps the attention on the suffering that Mary-Ellen and Roshan and Saad talked about in Afghanistan, which I'm also very concerned about. And I think that ultimately, will have to be the next thing that the US addresses as it tries to rectify what is a historically disappointing withdrawal and treatment of 38 million people.
Well said, Joseph. And I would say, just listening to Mary-Ellen and Saad's discussion and Roshan's brief about the situation inside of Afghanistan, coupled then with this idea that we're asking people to go through the asylum system to avoid being sent back, the juxtaposition there, I don't think could be more acute or powerful in terms of the need to push forward on the legislative and policy front on this issue. So
yeah, and Hardin, when you think about how polarized politics are in the U.S., to have an opportunity to do something that everybody is in favor of, these various constituencies, that's actually very unique. And so we just need to focus on taking that opportunity and doing something with it.
That's great. Thank you. And so we're beginning to also get a couple of questions from the audience, and I would encourage people to go ahead and drop in those questions as they have them. One of the issues that's popping up, and I think, Mary-Ellen, sort of to you, again, if you're looking at the sort of the way forward over this coming year, you're very close. I mean, it's August, here, it's August everywhere, and it feels, like winter may be a long way off, but it really isn't on the Afghan calendar. And in terms of the kind of planning that needs to be done, what are the couple things that we all need to be doing right now, and that you need from donors in particular to continue so that humanitarian firewall can hold?
Yeah, I mean, you're referring to what we call the pre-positioning for us, winterization for others, and it's really, I mean, Afghanistan is a stunningly beautiful country, and with that beauty comes immense hardship, and particularly in the winter, as many of the remote areas are cut off. So, and many of those remote areas are sadly the most food insecure areas, and we learned a big lesson last year. We were here choosing between those we feed today or we get food to somebody for next week. And we found there was a couple of districts in Gore we couldn't get into in time. We weren't able to pre-position. And in the latest food security assessment, we had famine-like conditions for the first time in Afghanistan. So, for me, that was a massive wake-up call. We need to be doing much, much more than pre-positioning this year. So we need to get 150,000 tons into those remote areas before the winter comes. And that means we need the funding today, because with the Ukraine crisis and the impact on food prices, the impact on supply chains, it's taking us longer to get things into the country. We try what we can to buy locally, but buying in the region, so I mean, for donors, it's basically, I need the money, and I just have to be shameless about it. We need the resources. On the food side, we need the resources. On the shelter side, we need the resources right across the humanitarian sector to be able to do the winterization plans. And also, before you leave me, I just want to pick up on something that you said when I finished the last time, and it really was remiss of me to, the incredible work that the national staff, the Afghan staff, have done on the humanitarian effort over the last year. But as you say, just hours after the 15th of August. I mean, it was incredible. I have never witnessed anything with the immense trauma that they were going through themselves and their families. They stood up and they delivered right across Afghanistan. And on the 18th of August, they were back at work again.
Thank you, Mary-Ellen. Saad, a question that's come in for the audience for you, and I think I'll put a little context around it. You're not only a very astute analyst of what's going on inside of Afghanistan, or observer, but also, a businessman and someone who's very deeply involved in the mass media market. And so from a sort of a business perspective, like thoughts about, we have an idea about how to strengthen the humanitarian firewall, but if we're not seeing some movement on the economy, we're not going to get out of this. So from what you're seeing, where are the first couple of steps? Is it the banking sector? Where are the places we really need to be pushing? And then also to some of the points that Roshan Mashal raised about girls and education, what opportunities for mass media, right, in terms of trying to facilitate and promote girls' education in Afghanistan at this stage?
Well, I mean, we're doing what we can in terms of amplifying messages from within the Taliban in terms of why girls need to go back to school from a religious perspective. And I checked a couple of days ago, we had done over 200 stories, excluding our town hall type meetings and current affairs programs. And even now, we're doing 4 or 5 stories a week in terms of the importance of girls going back to school. Now, we're not quoting UN officials, we're trying to quote hardcore Taliban clerics and religious as well as political leaders, people who are saying girls should go to school. And on this issue, clearly there are divisions. and on almost a third of the country, girls are going to school, not en masse, but the local officials are tolerating girls' education. The problem for education for all Afghans is that the system has been, in a pretty substandard education system, even going back to the Republic days. Even if girls can go back to school, what sort of an education will they get? A lot of teachers have left, and of course, schools will need to be segregated. There's a capacity issue with school teachers, so it's almost depressing to even think about when they do go back to school. In terms of business, the Taliban, if you look at their budget for this year, it's about $2 billion. It's not, in terms of what they will generate, not that different to the Republic days, perhaps $500 or so million less than what the Republic generated. So that's sort of impressive. They've been fairly honest. Again, it's all relative. But in a lot of ways, they are putting undue pressure on the business community. They're forcing every company to pay taxes, which probably they don't have. I mean, they're looking at the numbers from the previous years and saying, you have to pay this amount of money, and freezing bank accounts. So the way they're treating the business sector is pretty harsh. There is a possibility that many hundreds of companies will shut down because they can't pay their taxes and they have to leave the country. And there's really no incentive for people to go in because, you have the issue of sanctions, although the Treasury has made it fairly clear they're not going to punish companies that go and invest in the country unless they're dealing directly with the 20 or so sanctioned individuals. Nonetheless, there's not much confidence with the humanitarian situation, with the general poverty in the country. It's really tough. And again, it gets back to, okay, we survived the next month or two. What's going to happen next year? What's going to happen in 2024? What's going to happen in 2025? And that's why it's so important for the world to recognize that some form of development is important, some form of engagement is important, that they can actually manage the economy. They really lack capacity. They are relying on the former technocrats, but in a lot of ways, we're dealing with a very unsophisticated group of individuals who are managing this very large, complicated country.
Thanks, Saad. Yes, all very powerful points about the way it's very hard to see sort of how that piece on the business side and the economy side really begins to move forward under these current arrangements. Joseph, a quick question for you that's also come in. Your organization, that's something that I saw when I was out there, we're not seeing large numbers of Afghans move across borders yet, right? We are seeing a lot of people who wanted to leave the country, who didn't have the opportunity to leave the country, who are now sort of in very difficult circumstances. And this is the SIV population. These are other people, who have been specifically targeted by the Taliban. Do you want to say anything about the pathways that are available?
Yeah, I think evacuation or relocation, depending on how you want to term it, is still a big challenge. And I think in terms of what the Act does, it's a good question, Hardin, because one of the things that exists in addition to the backlog in the immigration system is a backlog in the SIV program, which is being litigated. We're involved in that litigation, and there are around 70,000 applications in that backlog. And one of the things that this Act does and that we're trying to accomplish is addressing that backlog. And so there's provisions in the Act to put more resources towards that population, but also it actually expands the eligibility. It expands the pool of Afghans who would be eligible for exit under these visas. Specifically, I'm addressing U.S. adjacent groups and groups like there's a group of women who are in the tactical unit in the armed forces, and now they'd be subject to these kinds of visas. So there are things that we're trying to bake into this legislation to address this issue of at-risk Afghans being able to leave. And we all know that not everybody is going to leave that wants to leave or should be able to leave given the level of risk they face. And so it's a game of whack-a-mole. And so one of the things we're trying to do is find opportunities to expand the pool of people who are eligible, and then have forcing mechanisms, right, for the executive branch to kind of put resources and process and get these folks out. So that's a part of the legislation that's really important for the Afghans who are left behind.
Thanks, Joseph. We're coming near the end of our time. And so I just thought, as I start to wrap up, Roshan Mashal, if you have a moment, one of the things that I found quite compelling when I was there was talking to sort of women-led organizations and NGOs and civil society who are still operating very carefully, but they're still there. And one of the things they called for, particularly in the humanitarian front, was, we can do more. Donors are beginning to pull back and not actually funding us in the way they had in the past. They think it's a sensitive issue, but we're seeing opportunities for trying to make progress in small ways in different places in our communities. Are there particular things that donors can do to support the women that you're working with?
بسیار زیاد تشکر. ما اول معذرت میخوایم که در جریان برنامه ما نتونستم کنترل اشکای خود بکنم وقت خانم مری از زیبایی.
Thanks for the opportunity. I did a little bit cry during my speaking, and those for the donors who help people of Afghanistan. But it's difficult for me to tell you everything. We should forget that we should not forget that all Afghan people cannot leave Afghanistan. It's very important. Those who work with the NATO and foreign troops or international organizations, they are eligible in order to come abroad countries. But we more focus on those people who don't work with the foreign troops and those around 38 million people who live there. We should find a ways for those people, and they are the victims in the regime of Taliban. And we have to find a way in order to save those people who left behind. And we want a democracy, and we give the power in the hand of the people, and all the people in Afghanistan should have a share in the political system of Afghanistan. The way that the Taliban come last year, and if they continue like this in the future, so we will not have a rights, especially the women's and female sectors of Afghanistan. And if the international country recognizes Taliban regime, it will be not fair with the people of Afghanistan, and it's an opportunity for every international terrorist groups that those who have a force of gun and battle, they will capture every country. That will not be fair. And we request from the United States of America and international donors and countries in peace process in 2018, we, the Afghan women, raise our voices in order to share all the aspects and concepts in the peace process. Unfortunately, whatever was happening in the peace process, and we women and females became the victims of that peace process, especially the women and girls of Afghanistan. And all the international countries who support the people of Afghanistan was destroyed in just one day. Today we need that whatever policies and strategies that we make, we have to support the people of Afghanistan, especially the female sectors.
مشوره‌ها دخیل بسازند تا که باز هم اشتباه سال 2021 در مورد افغانستان.
We want that in the future, whatever policies and the US and international donors make, they should share with the female sectors of Afghanistan.
تأکید ما بر این است که ما هنوز هم نمیخوایم که با طالبان با دسترسی به این.
And the second phase that I'm focusing that Afghanistan has a lot of minerals, and especially we don't want, especially the Taliban regime, use those minerals in order to sell to the neighborhood countries, and we want a clear system in order to extract the minerals from Afghanistan. Because the minerals, whatever is in Afghanistan, is for the people of Afghanistan, not only to the specific regime.
و دوم به خاطر حمایت از امنیت جهانی بسیار زیاد مهم است که برای بحران افغانستان رسیدگی عاجل صورت
Afghanistan crisis right now, we need the support from international countries. International donors and international countries should mainly focus on when distributing the foods and shelter, whatever, to the people of the Afghanistan, would make sure to distribute rightly and truly reach to the people who need it.
باید تقویه شود از طریق نهادهای جامعه مدنی مثل که ما تجارب بسیار
we should enforce and we should give more rights to the women, and the international donors and international countries should support the women's rights.
همچنان رسیدگی به مشکلات مردم بسیار یک رول مهم بازی بکنن به او اساس و به خاطر حفظ
we have to solve the crisis of the human rights in Afghanistan.
مسئله مهم دیگه که زمینه تحصیلات عالی با ارائه بورس ها
more important, there should be more scholarships from the foreign countries to the female sectors of Afghanistan, and we urge the international countries, international donors, in order to introduce an online education system in Afghanistan.
که امروز در کشورهای دوم حضور دارن و اونا
don't forget those Afghans who migrated to other countries and they are also not in good situation in other countries that they migrated, and those Afghans who are living currently, those Afghans who are living in other countries, they are on visit or work visa or other types of the visa, their visas are expired, so they don't give them refuge in that country. And we need a lot of donations and donors to those refugees like Afghans who are living in Pakistan, Tajikistan, and Turkey right now.
Azam که کمک‌های زیاد را در قسمت تخلیه افغان‌ها داشتن توجهشان می‌خوایم در این قسمت که
بعضی a lot of international donors here, so we request them in order to give them some donation for those people who are living out of the country of Afghanistan as a refugees.
Thank you.
And at the end, I request all you don't forget Afghanistan, because Afghanistan needs you and they need your supports. And please, instead of talking a lot, we work together in order to finish this crisis. We want to see Afghanistan with a democracy system where everybody has the equal rights. Thank you.
I thank you so much. I can't think of more powerful words, right, to close that our discussion on. I want to thank my fellow panelists for all of your insights, for taking the time to be here with us today, to our audience for taking the time. You know, it's a the 1 year anniversary. It's a significant moment. And one of the reasons we really wanted to do this session, and one of the reasons why we did some travel out to Afghanistan, was to try to maintain focus and attention of policymakers and the Western publics on what's happening in Afghanistan and on what we owe, right, to the people of Afghanistan moving forward. So I think you all have done that very effectively today. And so I'm very grateful for your time. Thanks again to the audience for joining us. And we hope that we've walked away here with some powerful ideas about next steps that we can take on the way forward. So thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hardin.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.